I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. With the death of Senate stalwart Bob Dole this past week, we were reminded of a less partisan time in national politics in Washington. In an analysis, Cheryl Gay Stolberg wrote in the Times that, quote, Mr. Dole reached across the aisle to help push through a string of bipartisan legislation, such as a bill to rescue Social Security, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and a measure to overhaul the welfare system. Much has been made of the hyper-partisan divide in the Capitol in our current era. President Biden crafts himself as an old-school political deal maker, and yet his poll numbers are weak. His low-key demeanor means that he might not get the credit for Democratic achievements, such as the massive public works bill. So is bipartisanship still viable? Or are the two main parties just drifting further and further apart? Or is there a way back to a time when there was at least more civility, much less collaboration in the Capitol? I'm joined by Trip Gabriel, a national correspondent for the New York Times. He's been keeping an eye on this theme in many state races this year, and Mara Gay of the Times editorial board. Mara, is there bipartisanship left in Washington? And is Joe Biden getting the credit that we think he deserves? What do you think?
I think the reality is that the political structure that we have from the Electoral College on down has created a situation where the ability of the parties to work across those lines is severely hampered. I think that unfortunately the Republicans, it's kind of a race to the right. And so even when you have a situation where a majority of Americans support, say, Roe v. Wade, or a majority of Americans support reasonable gun control restrictions, the people who represent, the Republicans who represent Americans in red states are not willing to vote that way and create policy that way. And that's because they're generally fearing that they're going to be primaried on their far right with the rise of Trumpism and the really extreme privileging of the extreme right within the Republican Party. So I don't know what you do about that. I think it's an existential threat to American democracy. But I don't think we can really both sides this one. This is not about Democrats not willing to compromise. The Democrats have an extremely large tent. In fact, arguably, that's a much harder challenge because there are so many different factions within that party. And I think Joe Biden is suffering from that. And then, of course, there are things that he could just simply do better. For example, one of his chief spokeswoman this week kind of poo-pooed the idea of directly providing free COVID tests to every household, instead suggesting that Americans can get reimbursed by their insurance instead. That's absurd. It shows how out of touch all politicians can be. And so the Joe Biden White House needs to get its message in order. But this is largely, I believe, about a Republican race to the bottom.
Trip, you've been looking at state races, gubernatorial races, Senate races, even legislative races over the past year, and obviously we're coming very close into the midterm election year, just a couple of weeks away. What do you see in terms of the elements that are going to influence that? One of the big ones, of course, is redistricting, also the question of open seats, retirements on both sides of the aisle. Where is that heading as we head into 2022?
Well, Sam, just to continue a little bit with what Mara said about the structure of our politics and our democracy, it's headed in the opposite direction from a more bipartisan politics. I mean, we're in the middle of the redistricting cycle, and we've seen far fewer House congressional districts that are genuinely competitive created compared to what the congressional map has looked like in previous iterations. So, you know, in a state like Texas, which used to have a handful of competitive districts, I think there's only one now after they've drawn their congressional maps. And I think, as Mara suggested, when you're an incumbent in a seat that in a district that is heavily favoring your party, your only concern is with your flank, either your left flank or your right flank. I mean, Democrats are also guilty of redistricting in an extreme way to push out Republican seats. We're seeing this perhaps in this week, I guess, in New Mexico and Maryland, but we've seen it already in other states that have Democrat-controlled states that have drawn the line. The midterms are still a year away. It's very hard to know exactly what's going to drive those elections. The recent results last month in Virginia, New Jersey, and elsewhere are very discouraging to Democrats. Republicans made broad advances in states, in places that Joe Biden had done well. And right now, it looks like the Supreme Court is going to overturn or severely limit Roe v. Wade. That Democrats think that will drive a lot of support toward their candidates. I'm personally more skeptical of that. Right now, inflation is a major concern of Americans, and 6% is the current inflation we've seen, which is the highest in 30 years. Prices of gasoline and groceries are high. These are kitchen table issues that affect voters even more than the big kinds of legislative packages that are moving through Congress, and they will probably it will just generate a lot of in whatever parties in power, whether they are genuinely, honestly, kind of responsible for inflation and rising prices, which are very complex mechanisms, will bear the brunt of voters' anger in the midterms if that continues.
Mm-hmm. Mara Asted heard it in the Times wrote the other day that there was a subtle shift in Biden's strategy in recent months, something that is quite interesting. There's no longer talk of a Republican epiphany on Mitch McConnell changing, becoming more bipartisan, the president going into his backyard to campaign against him. Now the White House looking more to rely on more centrist Democratic senators like Joe Manchin, like Kristen Sinema of Arizona for their pivotal votes. What's the impact of that likely to be on the president's legislative agenda and moving that agenda, things like voting rights and other things that have still been on the back burner?
I think it was a relief to see that shift, subtle though it may be in the moment. I think that the president has learned, hopefully, from his 8 years working with Barack Obama during a time period in which the Republican Party has actually become even more extreme, if possible, and unwilling to work with Democrats to accomplish anything. In fact, arguably, the Republican line is to prevent the Democrats from accomplishing anything, even to the detriment of their own voters at home in their districts. So, this is an important shift because it basically signals that Joe Biden is not going to be waiting for, as you said, this Republican epiphany, and is instead going to deal with the reality, the political reality that we have. The Democrats have to accomplish something more than they have already by the time of the midterms, or they know that they will lose power. Already, it's going to be difficult. I think the Biden White House is starting to really understand this. And so the hope is that folks like Joe Manchin are more persuadable than his Republican colleagues. I think it makes sense. It's yet another sign, though, of just the peril that our political system is in. I mean, you essentially have a one-party show right now. Only one political party seems interested in participating in American democracy. The Republicans seem most intent on blocking anything that the Democrats could get credit for, and then retaking power and ensuring that they remain there through minority rule by preventing Americans from voting. Those are the stakes right now. And I think any other discussion beyond that is
the problem.
Irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. Sure. In California, what is the likelihood that that is going to have a major change?
Well, actually, California's an interesting state. Our colleague Jonathan Weissman had a story this week about that. a huge state, many congressional districts. Most of them, Democrats have a majority of the districts, of course, but California draws its congressional maps with a supposedly bipartisan or independent commission, as opposed to a legislation, the legislature controlling the process. And the maps that are emerging this week look like they will actually increase the number of competitive seats in California, which should be for good government types. That's something to cheer about. One of the immediate results we saw this week is that Devin Nunes, who's kind of a bête noire for a lot of liberals because he's has been such a fierce Trump supporter in a pretty safe congressional district in rural California, was drawn out of a safe district, and rather than move or retire, he is retiring from Congress, and he's going to go work for Donald Trump's new emerging media company. But California in 2018 was a source of pickup seats for Democrats, particularly in Southern California and Orange County and places like that. That used to be Republican held. A lot of those districts look like they'll continue to be competitive. So it'll be perhaps the center of the midterm universe, which we haven't really seen in many cycles. I mean, so many of the other states that have been traditional battlegrounds are going to be, pretty much preordained, at least in terms of congressional races. And I'll just throw in one note about. I mean, Georgia is going to be in some other ways, the center of the ground zero of the midterm elections. You've got a very competitive congressional. A very congressional Senate race and a very congressional governor's race this week. David Perdue, a Republican, announced that he would challenge the sitting Republican governor, Brian Kemp, from his right. And it is a referendum on Donald Trump's big lie about a stolen election. And we'll see the same thing at the in a competitive primary for Secretary of State among Republicans. The Republicans who upheld the reality of Trump's loss in Georgia are being challenged by acolytes of Trump who are carrying the flag that that Trump really did win in Georgia, and that these Republicans who did the honest thing need to be thrown out of office.
How will the results in 2022 influence whether Donald Trump will run in 2024? Trip.
That's a very interesting question. If Donald Trump were a guy that kind of, rationally had a set of political scales that he looked at, where the balance was weighing out for him, you might think, well, that'll be a big factor. I don't think that what we know about Donald Trump, former President Trump, indicates that his decisions are made that way. I think that he will, if he hasn't already made up his mind to run, I believe he's probably made up his mind to run. I think it'll be more about timing, whether he wants to jump in ahead of the midterms and kind of use them as a kind of a national referendum on his power to endorse and the power of Republican support for him, or whether he waits until afterwards. We don't know, and we'll have to see.
Mara, this may be our last chance to ask you this while it's still current. Bill de Blasio finishing his second term as mayor. How would you rate his mayoralty? What has he accomplished? What are you disappointed about?
I think overall, he's been a responsible public servant, and his universal pre-K plan really shaped the city. There are some small signs. We have some early data that inequality in New York may have slightly decreased. How much credit you give the mayor for that is a different question. But I think, the other story of his mayoralty, unfortunately, is a story about missed opportunities. This is a mayor who came in with a really sweeping mandate, both from voters, but also he had an enormous amount of political capital and money at his disposal early on. And he missed a lot of
money in the city budget, you mean?
In the city budget. The city budget was really flushed when he came in. And, there certainly, he's made some good changes. I also want to say, the stop and frisk has decreased, and that has changed the lives of, tens of thousands of young New Yorkers, and that's great. But he really missed a lot of opportunities as well to do more. He could have done a lot more given the resources that he had. And I think also, he set up a situation in which Eric Adams is not going to have really any of those advantages as he comes into office. The budget situation is not what it was. And then, of course, the pandemic, which is not of Bill de Blasio's making, is going to mean that Eric Adams is going to have to make difficult decisions off the bat that Bill de Blasio didn't have to dream of in his 8 years in office. So the city's got some really hard work to do, but it's not in terrible shape. So I'm optimistic.
Very quickly, your expectations for Eric Adams.
I think that Eric Adams is going to be a return to the kind of mayors who love New York that we haven't seen in some time. He's already out on the town. Eric Adams has dreamt of being mayor his whole life. He's already having fun and he's not been sworn in yet. He's going to be out and about on the town. He's a very hard worker. I think people underestimate his intelligence, frankly. He's extremely smart, hardworking. I also think that we're going to see some wackiness as well. He's very unpredictable. My concerns are more about his judgment and the people around him than about his commitment to the city, but he's not to be underestimated. And I really think that he probably has the stuff to make a great mayor. He wants to be a good mayor. So let's see how it unfolds.
That's a good way to start out for sure. Mara Gay, Trip Gabriel of the New York Times, thank you for joining us. Coming up next, reproductive rights and the Supreme Court. Welcome back. On December 1st, the Supreme Court heard the Mississippi abortion law case, and many experts think that this could be the case that conservative justices could use to overturn Roe v. Wade. If Roe gets overturned, what happens to women's reproductive rights? Will red states immediately enact abortion bans? Will more liberal laws in states like New York survive? Lauren Kelley is a member of the New York Times editorial board. She focuses on women and reproductive rights. Lauren, how is it that when Roe was decided in January 1973, we are sort of back where we started from all that time ago? What happened in all that time, and why are we back at that starting point?
Thanks for having me. It's a really good question you have there. It's been nearly 50 years since Roe v. Wade was decided. Actually, the 49th anniversary of Roe v. Wade is coming up on, I believe, January 22nd. It might be, in fact, the last anniversary of Roe v. Wade. And that's because of the case that you just mentioned, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. That decision is going to come down probably in June, maybe in July. And there's really two realistic options on the table for how that case might play out. One is that Roe v. Wade is fully overturned. And another is that it is basically gutted. So really there isn't a likely option on the table for Roe v. Wade to survive in any robust form after this coming summer. In terms of how we ended up here, it's been a long journey. I've covered this topic for the better part of the past decade. And really starting around 2010, when the Tea Party movement wave sort of came in through those midterm elections, around then is when we started to see this huge wave of anti-abortion bills at the state level, just hundreds and hundreds of them. And, obviously there were many ways in which this was the stage was set years before that as well, but you really started to see things ramp up around that time. And, frankly, the anti-abortion movement has just passed so many laws at state legislatures at this point that by the time Trump came into office, and with the 3 Supreme Court picks that he was able to get during his term in office, the stage was just sort of set for a really big change in abortion law in America.
If the changes take place, either one of those alternatives that you talk about, what are the consequences of that in terms of individual states? Does that have any real impact in New York, or is it going to be a state by state decision? What does it mean for people all around the country?
Yeah, so in the short term, it will go back to the states. most likely. And again, there are some vagaries here about how exactly this will be decided. Nobody knows. Of course, the Supreme Court always sort of keeps us on our toes. But assuming things go the way that most experts I've talked to assume that it will, the issue would go back to the states most likely. And so in the short term, a state like New York would have abortion access. A state like Mississippi would not. The map more or less would look like the Southeast United States would have very little or no access to abortion. The Midwest would also largely have no access to abortion. And then there would be spots within there, Illinois, the coasts. For now, Florida actually does have abortion access. We'll see if that holds. But looking forward, I think it's actually really important to note that it is very, very possible that the anti-abortion movement does not stop with overturning Roe v. Wade, if that is indeed what happens in June. It is very possible that they will keep pushing for a national abortion ban, perhaps with a fetal personhood contingent. In that scenario, people in places like New York, like California, would absolutely need to think about, how abortion access in those states might also go away.
And you've written that eliminating the right to abortion would invite a enormous social and political backlash. But how would that manifest itself? What would that accomplish?
That's a very good question. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot in recent months. The conventional wisdom, and I have absolutely written this, is that there would be an enormous backlash, especially if Roe v. Wade is fully overturned. If the headline of the New York Times one day is Roe v. Wade is gone, the thinking for a long time has been that there would be an enormous backlash. I certainly hope that is still true. I do wonder, though. I wonder for a few reasons. One being that we are in this unprecedented time with COVID, with school issues that so many parents are having, with the sort of racist police violence that people have been protesting. There are just so many major issues going on in America right now. I do worry a little bit. And part of what makes me worry about a lack of a backlash next year is that recently Texas passed a law, SB 8, which bans abortion at 6 weeks. And you've probably read all about it. It made a lot of headlines. And there have been some protests regarding that bill, regarding that law. It's actually been in effect for the last 3 months. But the backlash hasn't been huge, and it makes me a little bit nervous.
And what are the consequences of that law? Has it been as dire in effect as people have expected?
Yeah, there is data out on this. If you look on the New York Times Upshot, you'll see some data from, I believe, the first month that it was in effect. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but abortions were down very significantly in the state in that first month. As the weeks go on, individual clinics can sort of only keep running for so long with these incredible restrictions in place. And so the real point of this law, I think, was to ultimately shut down clinics. It remains to be seen how long the law will stay in effect. We're still waiting on a Supreme Court decision on that matter. It could come anytime. But in the meantime, yes, it has been very severely restricted, and women in Texas are absolutely feeling that.
Lauren, earlier this year, you asked readers to send in their views on having had abortions or dealing with abortions. And you asked a very interesting question. You said, how did your decision on whether or not to have an abortion affect how you felt about reproductive rights? What were some of those answers?
Yeah, so we're working on a project related to that call out that you just mentioned. It'll come out in 2022. We have gotten, I was just absolutely floored by the responses we got. We've got nearly 700 submissions. And the responses are absolutely all over the map. You hear from women who were anti-abortion, had an abortion and it changed their minds. We hear from women who felt one way about an abortion. The abortion did not change their minds. It only made them feel stronger about their convictions. Truly, every possible outcome you can imagine is sort of represented here. And I think that that is actually a really important point, that lives are messy, people are complicated. You know, this issue gets distilled down to these political talking points, but in reality, again, people are messy and complicated creatures, and they feel, in reality, when it comes right down to the decision to actually have an abortion, they feel all sorts of different ways about it that just can't be distilled down to a slogan.
It's going to be fascinating to read the results of that in the Times. Thank you, Lauren Kelley of the Times editorial board, for joining us. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.